Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. Now I'm going to do something I haven't done on here for a little while. Don't worry, not that. I've been warned about that by YouTube. I'm going to do another History Reacts video. So this is another from the Oversimplified channel, which is a fantastic channel that I really love. The original video will of course be in the description. This is the Falklands War oversimplified. So this was a war that happened in 1982 between the UK and Argentina. A relatively small conflict, about 1,000 people were killed, but its political impact was massive. It played a big role in bringing down a Argentinian military junta, which is becoming very, very unpopular. In fact, that's part of the reason they launched the war in the first place. In the UK, it played a very big role in Margaret Thatcher securing re-election in 1983. And she was a totemic political figure who most Brits either love or hate, sort of a Marmite figure. So I'm sure there'll be lots to learn, and it's a great little video, so let's go.
Hi, English mariner John Strong.
Hi.
Hi, Anthony Carey, 5th Viscount of Falkland. I would very much like for you to go to Chile and locate the wreck of a Spanish treasure ship for me. Okay.
Sounds fair. That's what I've been told not to do. No dancing on the channel, for everyone's sake.
Hey, I found some islands.
MiniWars Part 1, the Falklands.
The English were probably not the first to discover the Falklands, but
True.
they were the first
The penguins got there
to
first.
write it down.
Yeah, penguins
They found
can't
it to be
write.
cold, wet, and miserable. Just like home. So they established a colony in 1765.
I'm not even going to argue with that. That's just objectively true. It hurts, but it's true.
Unaware that the French had also discovered the islands and done the same a year earlier. And for a while the two were unaware of each other's existence until presumably there was an awkward moment where they ran into each other.
Yes.
Then the Spanish showed up and told the French that a couple hundred years earlier the Pope drew a line on a map and said all of this belongs to Portugal and all of this belongs to Spain, and that the island was in Spain's territory and they would like the French
I mean, that's not an exaggeration. That's literally what happened. That's how geopolitics worked at the time.
to hand over their settlement. Now, since the two were good friends and Spain was willing to pay in cash money, the French obliged. But since they were still a little bitter about the recent 7 Years' War thing, they made sure to warn the Spanish not to let those dirty English on the other side of the island take over. So Spain went over to the English and explained, Pope, line on map, Spain's island.
Okay.
And the English said, yeah, right, this is our island. But
I would say England at the time was, of course, Protestant, so the Pope's word meant very little.
the Spanish had more guns, so they kicked them off anyway.
Yes.
But then England threatened to go to war. So Spain went to their friends in France and said, hey, it looks like stuff is about to go down. You in on this? And the French Minister of War said, yeah, and we'll launch a full-scale invasion of England and party like it's 1066. But then King Louis XV said, 1, you're insane, and 2, you're fired. Sorry, Spain, we're not ready for a war right now.
Okay,
so Spain
fair
had to give the English their settlement back, saying it's still our island, and the English said, no, it's our island. Then some colonists in North America got a bit rowdy.
Oh,
so
not
England
this
had to leave
again.
their settlement
We've been
to go
over
focus
that.
on that. But they left behind a plaque that said this is totally still our island. So the island was in Spanish hands, but then a French guy, no, not that one, that one, turned on the Spanish, took over most of the country, and
Yes.
captured King Ferdinand VII. And in response, the Spanish colonies in South America started vying for independence. So Spain had a little bit on its hands and also had to leave the islands. And for a couple decades, the islands were left uninhabited except for the penguins, some fishermen, and the gauchos, which are basically like cowboys but cooler and Spanisher.
I want to know more about them. That's not something I've ever heard of before.
A merchant from Hamburg living in the now independent United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata heard about the feral cattle roaming the Falklands and thought it would be a good way to make some money.
Okay.
So he got permission from both Buenos Aires and the British government to set up trade there as a private venture. Some American ships came down and began hunting whales and seals around the islands, and Vernet wasn't too happy about it. So he asked Buenos Aires for some military assistance in defending the islands, but Buenos Aires said, meh, do it yourself. Gave him some weapons, and appointed him governor of the islands. So he seized the US ships and arrested their crews. In response, 2 things happened. First, America came down and said, nice settlement you have
Yeah, I didn't think that was going to go well. As soon as they said arrested the American crews.
there. Would be a shame if someone destroyed it. And then they destroyed it. Second,
Yeah.
Britain heard Vernet had been appointed governor, meaning the United Provinces, actually now the Argentine Confederation, were officially claiming the islands as theirs. So Britain showed up and said, hey, didn't you see our plaque? And since they had more
Yes.
guns, they kicked them off the island. And the Falklands
That's probably history from about 1700 to 1950 in a nutshell. They had more guns, so they kicked them off. Sadly, I should say.
remained firmly in British hands for the next century. They officially became a crown colony in 1840. Port Stanley became the island's capital in 1845. The cattle hides from the island weren't worth much, so they imported sheep from Britain in 1851. 2 world wars came and went, and all this time the Argentinians never rescinded their claim over the islands. Now it's 1976, and after a couple civil wars, a new brutal military dictatorship sponsored by the US fight against communism has taken control in Argentina. And by 1981, this guy was in power. The economy had been struggling for a long time, and Galtieri had been unable to improve the situation. Now, if you ever find yourself the brutal military leader of a struggling South American country and you start getting into hot water, here's a bit of advice that has been tried and tested throughout the centuries. Start a war to distract everyone from their misery. Galtieri
It
knew how
would work
popular
really
he'd be
well.
if he could finally take back Argentina's Las Malvinas from the occupying British. There had been proposals to cut British military spending, and the ice patrol vessel HMS Endurance had been withdrawn from the area, so the Argentinians assumed the British may not even bother doing anything about the invasion. After easily capturing the largely uninhabited South Georgia island, 600 Argentine troops were sent to the Falklands. The small number of Royal Marines and other British forces stationed there put up a small amount of resistance, but in the end had to surrender to the larger Argentine force. Crowds in Argentina celebrated the news, but they were wrong to assume the British would do.
So it's important to emphasise just how obscure the Falkland Islands was in kind of 1981, 1982 to the vast majority of British people. I mean, the vast majority of people had no idea what it was. They couldn't tell you what continent it was in. It was just it had about, I think, about 2,000 people lived there. 2,000 sort of British overseas nationals, as they are now. But yeah, it was almost completely uninhabited, and most British people just didn't know where it was. But it still became a huge totemic issue. I mean, they're actually bigger than you think. They're about the size of Northern Ireland, so it's not a kind of like a couple of tiny little rocks in the middle of nowhere as some British overseas territories are.
Nothing, because the person in charge of the United Kingdom at the time was this lady. Thatcher was a somewhat controversial prime minister, but whether you loved her or hated her, there was no denying that she was tough, like metal. Iron, for example. She immediately declared an exclusion zone around the islands and organized for a task force of over 100 ships to set sail for the Falklands. The United Nations...
So, I mean, this is an interesting point, is that both the Argentine leadership and the British leadership at the time were very domestically unpopular at home. So, I mean, a big part of the reason the Argentines invaded was because the military junta, which had been disappearing people, torturing people, it was supported to some extent by the West as a kind of bulwark against communism. But they became very unpopular. They massively messed up the Argentine economy. Whereas in the UK had been going for a big recession. Margaret Thatcher at the time became very unpopular. And so around kind of 1982, it was very hard for either side to back down, because both sides were under huge pressure from their domestic publics, not to be humiliated, basically.
Expressed concern at the Argentine invasion. All South American nations apart from Chile backed Argentina.
And the Chile's a really important one. So even though Chile wasn't directly involved in the war, it was de facto on the British side. And a big part of the reason the Argentines could never send all their troops to the Falkland Islands, and certainly a lot of their best troops, was they were terrified that Chile would invade them, because they had a big border dispute with Chile at the time. So I mean, Chile was a really close UK ally.
And since the United States had propped up the Argentine dictatorship, Reagan went to Thatcher and said, "Could you maybe just let them have the islands?" And Thatcher said no.
So this is another really interesting point. For America, this war was a disaster. It was essentially two of their allies going to war. Argentina was a very unpleasant militaristic dictatorship, but it was anti-communist, and that counted for a lot. And of course, Britain was one of America's closest NATO allies. So the two going to war was, from the point of the US, a disaster, something they never wanted to happen.
Okay, here, have some weapons. Fighting a war over 8,000 miles from...
So, there was a type of missile called Sidewinders, and the Americans provided the British with lots of these Sidewinders for Harrier jump jets, which were extremely effective. So America did eventually basically tend towards the British side.
Was a logistical challenge for the British. They requisitioned civilian cruise ships and containers, and they used British-owned Ascension Island as a forward base. By the time they arrived at the Falklands in May, the Argentine forces had had time to entrench themselves. The first task for the British was to gain control of the seas, which they did easily. On the 2nd of May, a British submarine sank an Argentine cruiser. The sinking was controversial, as it occurred outside the British exclusion zone. It was also the largest...
I mean, what also made it controversial is that the Belgrano was sailing away from the exclusion zone when it was sunk. I mean, this isn't a politics channel. I don't want to sort of get into the rights and wrongs of things. I'm sure people will do that in the comments. The British argument was that there was an Argentine plan to do a pincer movement, essentially, with the Belgrano leading one Argentine squadron and the Argentine aircraft carrier, so they had one aircraft carrier at the time leading the other. And essentially the sinking of Belgrano knocked the Argentine Navy out of the war, which it pretty much did. Of course, the counter-argument is a lot of people died. Partly because the Argentine escort vessel was, after the Belgrano was struck, quite understandably, spent a long time trying to hunt the British submarine, which sunk them. And didn't pick up survivors for quite a while, because they were obviously terrified they'd be torpedoed as well. But yeah, no, it was really tragic. But as is everything in war, of course.
First loss of life in a single incident during the war, and in response,
Yeah.
the Argentine Navy withdrew from the islands. The next task for the British was to gain air superiority. While the Argentine Air Force controlled the skies, they were able to inflict considerable damage on the Royal Navy below. Days after the sinking of the General Belgrano, 2 Argentine superétendards carried out a raid on the HMS Sheffield and sank it with an Exocet missile. For weeks, the Argentine Air Force would continue to carry out raids and inflict heavy casualties on the Royal Navy, with British Sea Harriers doing their best to take out as many of the Argentine aircraft as they could. While the battle in the skies raged on, San Carlos was chosen as the best landing site for the British ground forces. An SAS raid took out Argentine defenses on Pebble Island, and the HMS Alacrity sailed through Falklands Sound to flush out any Argentine supply ships. The landings began on May 21st, with Argentine aircraft carrying out full-scale raids on the task force ships taking part in the landing, damaging several and sinking a few. But anti-air...
Yeah, it's worth remembering. I mean, the British actually lost quite a lot of ships during this war. I mean, it was not a walkover by any stretch. Indeed, so one of the things during the San Carlos landing is a lot of the Argentines had a big problem with their bombs not fusing properly. So they would hit British ships with their bombs, and it did sink several, but quite often the bombs wouldn't explode because the fuses weren't set right, or the aircraft had been flying too low because they wanted to avoid British missiles. If all the Argentinian bombs that had hit British ships had exploded, the British casualties would have been much, much higher. So to an extent, the British were quite lucky that the Argentines didn't manage to fix their fuses.
Aircraft cannons and Sea Harriers shot down many of the aircraft in what became a major turning point for air superiority, and a beachhead was successfully formed. Then the ground troops began their movements out of San Carlos, across the north towards Stanley, and south toward the Argentine stronghold.
So one of the big problems the British had is that all their helicopters, or almost all their helicopters, were being transported on a ship called the Atlantic Conveyor, which was struck by another Argentine Exocet missile and sunk. I mean, it wasn't the worst case scenario, because what the British are really terrified of is losing an aircraft carrier. They had 2, and even the loss of 1 would have made kind of continued British involvement in the war questionable. And the Atlantic Conveyor was almost being used to shield them to some extent. But it did mean that the British lost most of their helicopters and then had to literally walk across the Falklands in atrocious conditions. I mean, the atrocious conditions were also a problem for the Argentines. I mean, most of the Argentine soldiers were very young. They were conscripts. They didn't really want to be there, which is partly why they often surrendered quite quickly in the fighting.
Goose Green. In the following battles, a clear trend emerged. The Argentine conscripts put up a good fight, and with the rough, muddy terrain, the war was by no means easy for the British. But with highly skilled Royal Marine commanders and parachute regiment troops, the British would often find themselves taking on larger numbers of Argentinian soldiers.
And Gurkhas. The Gurkhas played quite a big role, and apparently the Argentines were completely terrified of them, which I understand. I mean, I'd be terrified if I was fighting them.
Would still come out victorious with minimal casualties. The 14-hour-long battle for Goose Green commenced on the night of May 28th. The battle ended in a decisive British victory, with over 900 Argentinians surrendering. Then, with 5,000 reinforcements arriving from the 5th Infantry Brigade, the British started preparing for their final assault on Stanley. In a series of hard-fought battles, they took control of the hills and mountains surrounding the town, as the Argentine forces withdrew, with British ships shelling their positions from offshore. Utterly surrounded, on the 14th of June, the Argentinians surrendered, and the war was over.
So this is another point. I mean, the Argentine commanders on the ground decided to surrender. But I mean, they could have tried to fought on. They could have forced the British to retake Port Stanley by force. I mean, you have a kind of a shootout inside the capital of the Falklands. If that had happened, I'm sure a lot more people would have died. So I think it's to the credit of the Argentine commanders that they recognised when they'd lost, and they didn't just throw away lives completely needlessly.
The 2-month-long war claimed hundreds of lives and left the islands strewn with minefields that still pose a problem to this day. Argentina still claims the islands, but in 2013 a referendum was held, and the islanders voted 99.8% in favor of remaining British.
Can you imagine being one of those 3 people? That is, you keep that opinion to yourself, wouldn't you? If you're a massive Argentine nationalist who lives in the Falkland Islands.
Plus, oil was just found near the islands, so the British probably aren't going to give them up anytime soon.
So yeah, the oil thing's interesting. I mean, there was an Argentine satirist who called the Falklands War 2 bald men fighting over a comb, which I think is a really kind of amusing and somewhat accurate description, certainly at the time. I mean, they had a tiny population. They were almost economically inactive. Now, of course, the Falkland Islands are actually economically more important because they've got big oil supplies have since been found. So it's kind of ironic that the value of the Falkland Islands economically has massively increased since 1982. Yeah, well, that was that was really interesting. I know a little about the subject. I might do some longer videos on it because it's something I find very interesting. Obviously, a tragedy for both sides, really, as all wars are. But yeah, I hope you found that interesting. I hope you found that enlightening. And please do subscribe, like, and I hope to be back soon. Thank you. I'll try not to leave it for another month or so before another history video.